In 1854, nestled in the verdant countryside of Connecticut, the Hartwell brothers, Silas and Jonathan, founded a mill that would become far more than a simple fixture of rural industry. The brothers, sons of a modest farming family, came of age in a period when America was expanding westward, cities were swelling with industrial promise, and the tension over slavery was beginning to crackle across the nation. Yet in the quieter corners of New England, life still revolved around rivers, land, and the communities bound to them. Silas, the elder by 4 years, was methodical and pragmatic, a skilled carpenter with a shrewd business sense. Jonathan, the dreamer of the pair, had a curious mind and an idealist's heart, drawn as much to books and reformist papers as he was to the creak and groan of mill machinery. The site they chose was along the banks of the Ashford River, a tributary known more for its serene flow than its commercial promise. Yet to the Hartwell brothers, it was perfect, its steady current ideal for powering a water wheel, and its location central enough to serve a growing population of farmers and tradespeople. They purchased 5 acres of land and began construction that spring, working by lantern light into the evening hours and drawing upon every bit of skill they had acquired from years of apprenticeship and labor. Local legend has it that the brothers built nearly every element of the mill themselves, stone by stone, gear by gear. The foundational walls were made from granite pulled from nearby fields, and the massive timbers supporting the roof were hewn from their father's woodlot. At the time, Connecticut was undergoing a subtle but powerful transformation. Small, family-run farms were beginning to give way to more specialized production. Towns were stitching together networks of roads and trade, and mills were evolving from seasonal flour producers into permanent commercial fixtures. The Hartwell Mill entered this moment of change with a unique proposition. It would serve not just as a place to grind grain but as a communal anchor, a site for commerce, conversation, and connection. The brothers did not merely intend to replicate what others had done. They were attentive students of machinery and invested in newer milling technologies, including improved grindstones, pulley systems, and adjustable sifting mechanisms. These innovations allowed their mill to produce finer flour at a faster rate than most competitors in the region. More importantly, the Hartwells structured their operation with an eye toward transparency and fairness. Farmers were paid promptly, even if their grain was of low yield, and the books were always open for review. Their honesty became a hallmark, and within a year, farmers from neighboring counties were hauling their sacks of corn and wheat to the Ashford River. But behind the timbered walls and creaking floorboards of the mill, something else was taking root. The Hartwell brothers, influenced by the growing reformist movements of the North, envisioned the mill as more than a place of production. On Sunday afternoons, when the wheels stilled and the doors closed to commerce, the mill's main room was cleared of grain sacks and opened for discussion circles, readings, and informal debates. Jonathan, especially, cultivated a network of local thinkers, educators, and activists who would gather to exchange ideas about labor rights, education, and, increasingly, abolition. None of this would have been possible without the trust and respect the brothers had cultivated during the mill's early days. In a small town where reputations formed quickly and lingered stubbornly, the Hartwells' integrity, their reliability, and their commitment to community welfare allowed them to operate with unusual freedom. Townspeople came not just for business but to seek advice, borrow tools, or simply sit by the stove and talk. The mill had become a place of daily rhythm, a place people trusted, where news was shared, deals were made, and a kind of local identity began to form. The physical structure of the mill itself reflected this multiplicity of purpose. Its wide front porch became a makeshift bench for the elderly, its loft was occasionally used to store books and pamphlets, and one corner of the lower floor was eventually fitted with a chalkboard and stools for informal lessons led by Jonathan in the winter months. The Hartwell Mill was not grand in scale, but in its first few years, it radiated an energy of creation, both of goods and of community. All of this began in 1854, not with grand ambition or political motive, but with 2 brothers and a clear understanding of what a mill could be in the right hands. Innovation in milling and community craftsmanship was at the heart of the Hartwell brothers' operation. From the earliest days of construction, Silas and Jonathan Hartwell were determined that their mill would not simply imitate the many others scattered across Connecticut's riverbanks. They believed in utility, yes, but also in imagination. Silas, with his precise mechanical mind, had spent time studying the mills in Norwich and Hartford, noting the differences in layout, materials, and efficiency. Jonathan, meanwhile, read widely from trade journals and agricultural bulletins that reported on developments in milling technology from England to Pennsylvania. Together, they began to sketch out a plan for a mill that blended the proven traditions of New England craftsmanship with bold, modern mechanics. They were early adopters of cast-iron gearing, a costly decision at the time, but one that paid dividends in both durability and performance. Most local mills still relied heavily on wooden cogs and shafts, which were prone to wear and required regular maintenance. The Hartwells sought to reduce downtime and increase output. They worked with a blacksmith in Windham to fabricate custom parts and collaborated with a wheelwright to design a more efficient overshot water wheel that could extract greater energy from the modest Ashford River. This allowed them to power more than one set of millstones simultaneously, enabling them to process grain at a much faster rate than their neighbors. But mechanical innovation was only part of their vision. The layout of the mill itself was designed with an unusual openness. Instead of the cramped and dim interiors typical of small rural mills, the Hartwell mill featured wide windows that bathed the interior in natural light. Floors were carefully spaced to allow easier movement of goods and people, and a small hoist system was rigged up with a rope and pulley mechanism to transfer sacks of grain between levels without relying on brute strength. These modifications not only made operations smoother but also demonstrated the brothers' respect for the dignity and safety of labor. They employed local craftsmen in nearly every phase of the build, offering fair wages and sourcing materials from within a 30-mile radius. This was not only a matter of economics, it was a conscious decision to make the community stakeholders in the mill's success. The mason who laid the hearthstones, the carpenter who shaped the eaves, and the coopers who crafted the flour barrels all became part of the mill's growing story. The Hartwells even went so far as to mark each major component of the machinery with the initials of its maker, a quiet tribute to the hands behind the tools. One of the most striking aspects of the Hartwell operation was their insistence on precision. Silas designed a rudimentary calibration system using marked wooden gauges and counterweights to ensure that the grind of each batch of grain could be adjusted with remarkable accuracy. This attention to detail led to flour that was not only more consistent in texture but also better suited to baking, a fact that quickly attracted the attention of local bakers and merchants. The Hartwell grind became something of a brand name in nearby towns, known for its fine finish and lack of chaff. Jonathan, meanwhile, explored uses for the mill beyond the processing of wheat and corn. Drawing on ideas from agricultural reform literature, he experimented with grinding alternative crops such as buckwheat and rye, and even began testing the production of meal for livestock feed. He corresponded with other mill operators across New England, exchanging advice and observations, and he documented his findings in meticulous notebooks that he later shared with neighboring farmers. His goal was not simply profit, but the elevation of rural agriculture through access to better tools and knowledge. The community quickly responded to this spirit of innovation. Farmers began timing their planting and harvesting to align with the mill's peak efficiency, knowing that quick turnaround meant fresher product and better yields. Artisans came to observe the mill's mechanisms, copying some of the ideas for their own workshops. Even schoolchildren were invited on occasional tours, where Jonathan would explain the science behind the water wheel and the logic of the gear ratios with patient enthusiasm. The mill became a kind of classroom as well as a factory. At a time when many mills operated with secrecy, guarding their techniques jealously, the Hartwells did the opposite. They welcomed curiosity and fostered a kind of local intellectualism rooted in practical work. Their innovations did not merely reside in steel and stone but in the relationships they nurtured with the people around them. Innovation in milling and community craftsmanship remained a central force in the evolution of the Hartwell mill. From the moment the first beam was raised, the Hartwell brothers viewed the mill as a living workshop, one where machines, methods, and people could evolve together. The Industrial Revolution had already begun reshaping the American Northeast, with factories and mechanized systems spreading from cities into the countryside. But in 1854 Connecticut, many small towns still clung to old ways, and traditional milling practices were often slow, inconsistent, and heavily labor-dependent. Silas and Jonathan Hartwell saw this as an opportunity not only to improve production but to reimagine the mill as a hub of technical progress grounded in local skill and collaboration. Silas, who had spent time working as a machinist's apprentice in New Haven before returning to the family farm, brought with him a knowledge of gears, levers, and pulleys that went far beyond what most rural millers understood. He had studied the way water power could be redirected and intensified, and how belt-driven systems could synchronize multiple tools from a single power source. With Jonathan's equally methodical mind and interest in agricultural mechanics, the two began experimenting with designs that would allow for higher output with greater reliability. They constructed their own adjustable sluice gate that regulated water flow to the overshot wheel, allowing them to conserve energy during dry spells and maximize power during peak river conditions. Unlike many mill operators who used second-hand or outdated equipment, the Hartwells custom-built many of their components. They sourced iron and brass from regional foundries but insisted on assembling the machinery themselves, ensuring each gear and shaft was aligned to their exact standards. They implemented dual sets of millstones, one for coarse grinding and one for producing finer flour. This not only widened the range of products they could offer but allowed them to serve different types of customers, from home bakers to large-scale suppliers. To reduce the risk of contamination and improve hygiene, a rare concern at the time, they designed wooden chutes and bins that could be disassembled and cleaned, and they maintained a rigorous schedule for inspection and maintenance. The physical structure of the mill reflected their commitment to both innovation and practicality. They laid out the floors to minimize wasted movement, placing the intake platform near the river-facing wall and designing a gravity-fed path for grain through the mill's processing levels. Grain would enter at the top, move through the grinding stones, and then be sifted and bagged at the lower floor, where finished flour was loaded directly onto carts. This vertical flow design minimized the need for lifting and reduced the number of laborers required to keep the mill running. At full capacity, the mill could process nearly twice the volume of a traditional operation of similar size. Community craftsmanship was equally vital to this innovation. Rather than importing workers or relying on outside contractors, the Hartwells turned to local artisans for the skills they needed. They hired a cooper from nearby Mansfield to build custom grain barrels, and a carpenter from Eastford helped design storage racks that allowed flour to cure evenly before shipment. In return, the brothers paid fair wages, provided meals during long workdays, and occasionally offered shares in flour profits to particularly skilled or dedicated craftsmen. This created a sense of collective ownership and pride in the mill's success. Jonathan, always the educator, made it a point to involve local youth in the operation. On weekends, he offered informal apprenticeships to boys interested in engineering or trade work, letting them shadow him as he repaired belts or adjusted gear ratios. These young apprentices learned not just to operate the machines but to understand the principles behind them. One former apprentice would later credit his time at the Hartwell mill with preparing him for a career in mechanical design in Hartford's growing industrial sector. Jonathan also wrote short instructional guides for farmers on how to better store and prepare grain before milling, and he was known to spend hours walking someone through the reasons why one batch of flour came out better than another. The Hartwell brothers never viewed innovation as a one-time achievement. They saw it as a constant dialogue between need and possibility, between the limitations of the present and the potential of what could be created through cooperation and ingenuity. Their respect for craftsmanship, and their belief that machinery should serve people and not the other way around, earned them admiration from both rural families and traveling tradesmen. The Hartwell Mill, from its earliest days, was more than a site of industry. It became a gathering point, a crossroads where conversation and connection unfolded as naturally as commerce. In the mid-19th century, rural Connecticut was still shaped by small, tight-knit communities, and public venues where neighbors could regularly meet were few. Churches served that role on Sundays, and general stores offered fleeting exchanges during errands, but the Hartwell mill provided something different. It operated daily, drew people from neighboring towns, and gave them a reason to linger. In time, it became a social and political hub as much as it was a place for grinding grain. Each morning, wagons would arrive from farms scattered across the region, some traveling hours before dawn to secure a good place in the queue. Farmers brought with them not only sacks of wheat or corn but news, opinions, rumors, and stories. While the grain was weighed, logged, and processed, its owners would often remain for hours, talking on the wide porch, warming themselves near the cast-iron stove in colder months, and swapping advice on planting, livestock, tools, and weather. Silas Hartwell, though often busy with machinery, made time to join these conversations, offering insights drawn from his meticulous study of farming manuals and market reports. His calm, deliberate presence helped shape the mill into a place where facts mattered and thoughtful discourse was encouraged. Jonathan, meanwhile, saw in this daily gathering something with even more potential. He had long been drawn to the reformist literature coming out of Boston and New York, tracts about education, temperance, abolition, and democracy, and he believed rural communities deserved a space to engage with such ideas. With his brother's support, he began stocking a small bookshelf in the corner of the mill with newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches printed by reform presses. These materials, available for anyone to read while they waited, began sparking conversations that moved well beyond crop yields and market prices. It wasn't long before Sunday afternoons at the mill took on a life of their own. The machinery was quiet, the grinding stones still, but the room remained open. Benches were pulled into a circle, coffee was brewed over a small fire out back, and neighbors gathered not to trade goods, but to trade ideas. Jonathan sometimes read aloud from Frederick Douglass's speeches or from the works of Horace Mann on education. Other times, local ministers or teachers would lead discussions on civic engagement or moral philosophy. These gatherings were informal but deeply meaningful. They became known simply as Sundays at the Mill, and attendance grew steadily, with men and women alike drawn by the rare opportunity for open, respectful dialogue. The space also began to function as an informal town forum. Disputes over land boundaries, road maintenance, or school funding, issues that might otherwise fester in isolation, were brought into the open and discussed around the stove or on the porch. Because the Hartwell brothers were widely trusted for their fairness and neutrality, their mill became a kind of unofficial arbitration ground. More than one local disagreement was settled not in court, but over a handshake by the grain scale, after a conversation brokered by Silas or Jonathan. In time, the political character of the mill deepened. As tensions over slavery intensified in the 1850s, the Hartwells did not shy away from allowing discussion of abolitionist ideas within their walls. Jonathan, in particular, began inviting speakers traveling through the region, writers, lecturers, and former slaves who had escaped north, to share their experiences. These events were sometimes discreet, especially as the Fugitive Slave Act hardened local divisions, but they were never secret. The Hartwells believed in the responsibility of free citizens to be informed, and they trusted their neighbors to listen with open minds. In an era when many in rural areas had little access to the broader national conversation, the Hartwell mill served as a vital conduit. Young people, too, found a place in the mill's communal life. When school was out, older boys helped with hauling and lifting, but they also listened. They sat in on Sunday discussions, read from the small library, and absorbed a model of civic engagement rarely found in schoolhouses. Girls, often tasked with accompanying younger siblings, were welcomed by Jonathan to participate in readings and discussions, something not always permitted in other public forums. In this way, the mill subtly pushed against some of the social limitations of the time. The Hartwell mill became a place where words carried as much weight as grain, where ideas were exchanged with as much regularity as flour sacks. The clatter of machinery during the workweek gave way to thoughtful silence and spirited conversation by the weekend. The building's timbers soaked in both the dust of labor and the breath of dialogue, and over time, people began to associate the place not just with production, but with participation in something larger than themselves. The role the Hartwell brothers played in the abolitionist movement was woven quietly but firmly into the fabric of their daily lives and decisions. In 1854, Connecticut was a state deeply divided, not in open conflict like the South, but in quieter ways that shaped towns, churches, and households. Abolitionist sentiment was growing, especially in the northern parts of the state, yet resistance remained strong among those who feared economic repercussions, social upheaval, or simply preferred not to engage. In this environment, taking a public stand against slavery required a particular kind of courage, less dramatic than in the cities, but no less real. Silas and Jonathan Hartwell chose to make their stand not with fiery speeches or grand gestures, but through quiet action, consistent values, and the use of their mill as a subtle but powerful tool for change. Jonathan Hartwell had been influenced early on by the writings of William Lloyd Garrison and the powerful oratory of Frederick Douglass. He had heard Douglass speak during a trip to Hartford in the early 1850s and returned home stirred by both the content of the speech and the electrified energy of the crowd. Jonathan believed deeply that moral responsibility did not stop at personal conduct, it extended to how one shaped the spaces and systems around them. For him and for Silas, the mill they had built was not just a place to grind wheat, but a platform for promoting justice in a community that often preferred to avoid political confrontation. The brothers' first known act of abolitionist support came in the form of literature. Jonathan began quietly distributing pamphlets and newspapers with anti-slavery content, placing them in a small wooden rack inside the mill near the resting bench where farmers often sat while waiting for their grain. Titles like The Liberator, The National Era, and local abolitionist leaflets were rotated weekly, left in plain sight, but without comment. Some visitors ignored them, others glanced with curiosity, and a few took them home. Jonathan never forced the material on anyone, but when asked, he answered with a gentle firmness that slavery was a moral wrong and silence was a form of complicity. As tensions around the Fugitive Slave Act grew, so did the brothers' involvement. Sometime in the winter of 1855, the Hartwell Mill became a known way station for escaping slaves traveling northward along the Underground Railroad. Though not officially documented in any public registry, oral history preserved in local families spoke of the Hartwells offering shelter in the loft above the main mill floor, where the scent of grain and the hum of machines masked the presence of those in hiding. The space was modest, a few blankets, a water bucket, and some dried goods, but it was safe, and that alone was more than many could offer. The river nearby made for quick transport or escape if needed, and the steady stream of wagons coming to and from the mill provided cover for unexpected comings and goings. Silas, though quieter and more reserved than Jonathan, was equally committed. He handled much of the logistical work, coordinating with other sympathizers in neighboring towns, storing supplies, and maintaining the mill's operations so that nothing appeared out of the ordinary. He also built a hidden storage compartment beneath a stack of unused flour barrels in the rear storage room. It was narrow and dark, but large enough to conceal one or two people temporarily if sudden inspection was required. Their efforts were not undertaken without risk. In 1856, a traveling inspector asked probing questions about unusual activity at the mill, and for several days, the brothers operated under the pressure of potential exposure. But their reputation for fairness, reliability, and discretion helped shield them from suspicion. Beyond their covert activities, the Hartwells also worked to shape opinion through personal relationships. When neighbors expressed uncertainty or opposition to abolitionist ideas, the brothers responded not with condemnation, but with questions, stories, and examples. Jonathan often cited scripture, appealing to moral authority in a region where religious conviction ran deep. Silas spoke practically, noting that justice did not disrupt good business, and in fact, fairness was the cornerstone of any sustainable economy. They never sought to shame or alienate, but to persuade, patiently and persistently. Younger townspeople, especially those who gathered for the Sunday discussions at the mill, were often more receptive to the message. Jonathan made a point of including abolitionist voices in the readings and conversations, and over time, more and more participants began to ask questions, challenge inherited assumptions, and see the issue not as a distant Southern problem, but as a test of their own community's conscience. The Hartwell brothers did not lead marches or speak from pulpits, but their steady presence, moral clarity, and quiet acts of resistance marked them as key figures in the region's growing abolitionist network. The economic impact of the Hartwell Mill on rural Connecticut was both immediate and lasting, reshaping the rhythms of trade, the viability of small farms, and the structure of the surrounding community. Before the mill's construction in 1854, local farmers were often forced to transport their grain to distant towns, sometimes over 20 miles away, just to have it processed. This meant days lost to travel, money spent on boarding or cart repair, and the risk of delayed or spoiled deliveries. For many, it also meant settling for uneven or inconsistent milling, especially from larger operations that prioritized volume over quality. The arrival of the Hartwell Mill changed that dynamic, offering a closer, more reliable option that quickly became a cornerstone of the region's agricultural economy. Within the first year, word of the mill's efficiency began to spread. Silas Hartwell's insistence on precision equipment and Jonathan's dedication to fair dealing created an operation that was both trusted and admired. Farmers who had once hesitated to grow grain crops in larger quantities due to unreliable processing began to shift their planting strategies. Wheat and corn production increased incrementally across the region, encouraged by the knowledge that a dependable mill stood nearby. The Hartwell Mill not only accepted the grain but returned a finished product that was clean, fine, and consistent, qualities that led to higher market prices and improved profitability for local producers. The economic benefits extended beyond the farmers. The increased grain traffic required more wagons, more labor, and more storage facilities, which in turn led to new jobs and secondary industries. Blacksmiths were called upon more frequently to repair wagon wheels and shoe draft horses. Local carpenters found work building granaries and additional barns. A cooperage was established within 2 miles of the mill to keep up with the growing demand for flour barrels. Even local merchants saw a rise in sales as farmers, with more stable income, began purchasing more tools, cloth, and household goods. The activity surrounding the mill acted like a stone dropped in a pond, its ripples touching nearly every economic layer of the area. The brothers also implemented systems that increased fairness and efficiency in trade. Silas introduced a standardized weighing process, using counterbalanced iron weights that had been tested against certified measures from Hartford. This transparency eliminated disputes and gave farmers a sense of security in their transactions. Jonathan kept meticulous ledgers and was known for providing itemized receipts, a rarity in an era when verbal agreements and vague notes were often the norm. Their reliability became a form of local currency, trust in the Hartwell name carried weight, and businesses associated with them found themselves elevated in standing. During harvest season, the mill extended its hours, sometimes running well into the evening to accommodate the crush of wagons lined up along the riverside path. Rather than charge higher fees during peak times, the Hartwells maintained flat rates, believing that consistency fostered loyalty and long-term success. When a drought in 1857 caused lower-than-expected yields, the brothers offered partial credit or delayed payment options to struggling farmers. This decision, seen by some as financially risky, in fact solidified their customer base and earned the gratitude and long-term business of many families. Beyond direct commerce, the mill helped reinforce the idea that local infrastructure could support sustainable economic development. It became an example cited in town meetings and agricultural societies, proving that investment in quality, fairness, and innovation could lift entire communities. In one recorded meeting of the Windham County Agricultural Board, a speaker pointed to the Hartwell Mill as evidence that rural economies could thrive without needing to rely entirely on urban markets or state subsidies. The brothers were invited to participate in discussions on expanding rural trade networks, and their ideas on cooperative pricing and shared transportation were adopted by other towns in the region. The growth surrounding the mill also sparked small but meaningful shifts in settlement patterns. A cluster of new homes appeared within a short distance of the mill, occupied by families who worked either directly at the site or in businesses tied to it. A schoolhouse was built on land donated by the Hartwells, and several small shops sprang up along the main road, offering goods and services to the increasing number of travelers and laborers passing through. What had once been a sleepy bend in the Ashford River slowly transformed into a vibrant, semi-urbanized hub with its own distinct economic identity. The economic stability provided by the Hartwell Mill allowed families to remain on their land, to reinvest in their property, and to think about more than mere survival. It gave young people alternatives to city work, offering apprenticeships and training in trades that supported regional needs. It encouraged farmers to diversify their crops and explore market opportunities, confident that they had a partner in processing and distribution. The success of the mill demonstrated that prosperity could be built not only through scale, but through integrity, precision, and mutual respect between producer and processor. 5.